Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 7, Day 4. The first thing you need to get completed is your journal. The question today, what was the goal of early companies in creating a monopoly? What benefits did it present? And what were some other options in regards to monopolies? We talked about monopolies in Day 3, and you should have a pretty good understanding of what those are. Talking about Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, any of those men that you can think of that we may have read about or talked about yesterday. Please make sure that you get those down. So, your journal also needs to be 4 to 5 sentences. Make sure each journal that you complete is 4 to 5 sentences. That is the expectation. All right, today we're going to be talking about the struggles of early industry. All right, we've kind of hit the same thing in Day 3, and now we're going to come and hit the same thing again in Day 4. And we're going to talk about the rest of what has happened in our country during this time in regards to what reform movements are being pushed, how are workers responding to these conditions, things of that nature. Our essential question for the day is, how did socialism affect American society and industry in the late 1800s? We also want to talk about in what ways did industry aid in providing opportunities, but also in providing hardships for immigrants and Americans. So we're going to try to look at just how are businesses functioning, also what is the downside from what's going on, etc. Now, socialism was very much on the rise during the late 1800s into the early 1900s, and you're going to see that especially in the 1900s when we get a little bit closer to some of the Red Scare stuff and some of the different things with communism. But during this time, the richer were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer. And there was this huge widening gulf or gap between those who had money and those who did not. And the industrialists, they were making money as fast as they could possibly, almost as if they were printing it. And to prove that, about 1890, they took a census, and 9% of Americans held 75% of the national wealth. That meant that for the other 91% of America, there was only 25% of the overall wealth available to them. That is a staggering statistic. As you've heard me say before, that is as staggering as they come. Now, the idea of socialism was advocating collective or government ownership of factories and prosperity, or I should say property. Okay? And what the idea is that you let the government divvy out the money and everyone gets an equal portion, and there is no real rich or poor. It's just everybody's equal. Well, the one problem with socialism is there's not enough money for everyone to be rich and no one to be poor. And so in turn, what you end up with is the equally distributed wealth ends up nobody has anything. And it's just the government has power and the people have none. Now, one goal is to distribute society's wealth equally. And that is the idea that I told you behind socialism. In the late 1800s, Karl Marx, a German philosopher, he believed that our capitalistic system would actually fall flat on its face, that it would be overthrown by the workers who would not put up with low wages and harsh conditions, which he wasn't completely wrong about the workers rising up. It's just they're not going to try to overthrow capitalism. They're going to try to overthrow the bad practices that we talked about a little bit yesterday. Americans felt it threatened private property and free enterprise. That was one of their biggest issues with socialism and with Karl Marx's idea that, I want to be able to own my own property. Well, under socialism, you would not be able to do that. I want to own my own business. Well, under socialism, you're not allowed to do that. The government controls what businesses open, how they function, etc. Now, in 1883, Lester Frank Ward, a known socialist, wrote the book Dynamic Sociology, and he argued that society is governed by human intelligence, not nature. And that basically it's not natural for men to rise and take lots of money and power, that, we should govern our society by our own brains and our own minds. So that idea of laissez-faire or this hands-off approach where, this social Darwinism, if you want to say that, he realized that was not correct, that's not, or at least that's what he believed. I shouldn't say that that's not correct. He believed it was not correct. And that's kind of going to push further this book, along with various other things, kind of this socialist point of view. Now, the American Socialist Party forms in the 1870s as the Socialist Labor Party, and eventually they will become the American Socialist Party as the period continues. But they believed in government control of wealth and its distribution. So once again, just another group that's promoting that socialistic idea. Now, in 1879, Henry George wrote the book Progress and Poverty, which he blamed all of our social problems on the monopolies and rising prices of land. And essentially what he said was that there needed to be some sort of tax on this land and on these industrialists that would basically distribute money back to the community and redistribute the wealth. Because what was happening is land that, let's say I bought 2 acres of land in 1870. Okay, well in 1880 that land's worth probably twice as much as it was in 1870, and so on and so on. Think about how cheap you hear about them talking about buying land in the 1850s versus buying land in 2020. For example, I saw there was 25 acres for sale for $250,000. Well, $10,000 an acre, that's very expensive in comparison to the fact that I could have spent the same amount of money, and especially if you put it in the, you look at inflation and all the factors that come along with money and how much $10,000 was worth then, they'd have bought me 150 acres probably. So he's not wrong in the fact that the price of land is going up, but what he believed was part of our social problem is that these industrialists own this land and they're making this money that they really have done nothing to earn. It's just naturally accruing, and that there needed to be some sort of tax that would distribute this money back to the American people because it's all of our land in a sense is the idea. So that goes back to that socialistic idea that everything is, under one roof and under the government. Edward Bellamy was another socialist author. He wrote the book. It was a utopian novel called Looking Backward. And essentially a Bostonian from the year, I believe it's 1870s, wakes in the year 2000. And this is what he finds. He finds one single trust. So every bit of investments, companies, all these things that have been put into trust in order to benefit the trustees and the beneficiaries are now into one single trust. So basically the government's controlling everything. There's no class system and the wealth is being distributed equally. And it's a great theory and sounds great, but the problem is it doesn't work. And if you don't believe it doesn't work, you can go back to the 1950s and 60s and 70s and study Russia. Now, industrialization and workers, that's going to kind of be our next section that we're going to go through, and we want to talk about the growing workforce that's in America. Roughly between 1860 and 1900, some 14 million people arrived in the United States, and the United States was actually attempting to recruit some immigrants. They were looking to recruit some of the best and brightest, but also just recruit workers because there were so many jobs. And because there were so many jobs, millions of U.S. citizens actually fled poor farms and cities. And so they did this because they could make more money in the city and their whole family could work and make money, and they didn't have all the strain of trying to survive. It was stabilized and set by someone who's basically taken the brunt of all the organization. Now, the problem with this you're going to see here in a second, which is the wages are very low, among other things, and it's going to be very dangerous work. But most kids left school at the age of 12 or 13, and they would go to work in a factory. They did not continue to go to school, especially with farms shutting down. They pretty much left and moved on with their life as a young child. Now, working in the factory was very tough. Generally, it was 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Guys, that's a long day. If you don't understand how long 12 hours a day is, you ought to go work a job and work 12 hours for about 3 to 4 days, and you will understand that it is rough. And to do it 6 days a week and have 1 day off, and then sometimes they had no days off. That's a lot. That's a lot on one person, especially not being paid a lot and working in very bad conditions. Many of the workers that did go into these factories were working on what they call piecework. You were basically paid as much as you could produce during your shift. So, let's say I was building chairs and I get paid, and this time let's say it's $1.50 a chair. If I can produce 3 chairs in a day, then I'd get paid $4.50. And so that's kind of the idea here is, you pay a worker how much they get done, which is great in a sense because it's, actually paying on pure production. So if you're really good at your job, you might be able to make a lot more money than someone else. This is going to also lead to eventually, and we'll talk a little bit more about this with Henry Ford, the assembly line is going to develop in the early 1900s with the Model T Ford and the cars that Ford is going to build. And essentially what it is the workers were on one end or the other of the line, and you're making one piece that goes on a bigger piece, okay, until eventually you have a finished product. So for example, if it's a car and this chassis is moving down the line, I might be the guy that puts the left front wheel on, and I'm always putting left front wheels on. That's what I'm doing all day. But it helped efficiency. The problem is early on there wasn't a lot of regulations, and safety was an issue and various other things. The other big problem here is that workers are subject to the boom and bust cycle of industry. So, these industries are going really up and really down very, very quickly, unless you're in probably one of the more important factories. But even then, there was a lot of issues in those, which you see with some of the strikes that we'll talk about later on. By 1900, many states passed laws banning child labor. Unfortunately, most factories just ignored them. Now, life in the factory was not easy. Discipline was strict. You could be fired for being late, answering back a question, you could be fired. Talking, minor offenses that absolutely today, if you got fired for, you'd be suing and people would be upset. But that wasn't the way it was then. It was also noise deafening. There was no, protective earwear or protective eyewear. There's bad lighting, bad ventilation, and somewhere around about 675 people were killed on average in the factories, and that's compared to 200 today. So think about, we've cut that number in basically over half. And guys, we've got twice the amount of factories today. The difference is we've got so much more automated things and safety precautions and regulations that regulate these businesses that just didn't exist during this time. There's also a large amount of workers, and we talked about all those immigrants, and because there was no shortage of workers, this allowed businesses to basically do what they wanted to do, and they did not have to follow regulations. Irish, German, and Italian immigrants needed work, and so they were willing to do whatever they had to do to get a job. Now, women were also in the workforce during this time, but unfortunately they were given the most unskilled or least skilled jobs possible. They were generally the worst jobs in the factory, and there was no advancement. If you were a woman, you were going to be stuck in that job for your entire life. Now, the heavy lifting or heavy, or intensive labor type jobs, those were still going to the men at this time. Women were generally not allowed to take those jobs. They were most of the time in factories that were like textile mills and things of that nature, especially textiles. That was a large part of where women worked. Children also worked in many of these factories, and they worked in the poorest of conditions, especially at a young age. That was not good for their lungs or their hearing or anything else as they're developing. But if they didn't work, the family may not eat, and that was pretty much the only way that family was going to survive, is that child working. Like I said, they were given the very dangerous of all jobs. However, 60% of all the kids are still working on the farms, mainly because they're exempt from child labor laws because they're with their family or something of that nature. But even then, in the cities, like I said, the factories are just ignoring these laws, so it really didn't matter. All right, here's your vocabulary. Make sure you get those words down, and please let me know if you have any issues.